Some of his sayings, of course, survive in family tradition. He was once calling on a gentleman, notorious for never opening a book, who took him into a room overlooking the Bath Road, which was then a great thoroughfare for travellers of every class, saying rather pompously, "This, doctor, I call my study." The doctor, glancing his eye round the room, in which no books were to be seen, replied, "And very well named too, sir, for you know Pope tells us the proper study of mankind is man." When my father went to Oxford, he was honoured with an invitation to dine with this dignified cousin. Being a raw undergraduate, unaccustomed to the habits of the university, he was about to take off his gown, as if it were a greatcoat, when the old man, then considerably turned 80, said with a grim smile, "Young man, you need not strip. We are not going to fight." This humour remained in him so strongly to the last that he might almost have supplied Pope with another instance of the ruling passion strong in death, for only 3 days before he expired, being told that an old acquaintance of his was lately married, having recovered from a long illness by eating eggs, and that the wits had said that he had been egged on to matrimony, he immediately trumped the joke, saying, "Then may the yoke sit easy on him." I do not know from what common ancestor the Master of Balliol and his great niece Jane Austen, with some others of the family, may have derived the keen sense of humour which they certainly possessed. Mr. and Mrs. George Austen resided first at Deane, but removed in 1771 to Steventon, which was their residence for about 30 years. They commenced their married life with the charge of a little child, a son of the celebrated Warren Hastings, who had been committed to the care of Mr. Austen before his marriage, probably through the influence of his sister, Mrs. Hancock, whose husband at the time held some office under Hastings in India. Mr. Gleig, in his Life of Hastings, says that his son George, the offspring of his first marriage, was sent to England in 1761 for his education, but that he had never been able to ascertain to whom this precious charge was entrusted, or what became of him. I am able to state from family tradition that he died young, of what was then called putrid sore throat, and that Mrs. Austen had become so much attached to him that she always declared that his death had been as great a grief to her as if he had been a child of her own. About this time, the grandfather of Mary Russell Mitford, Dr. Russell, was rector of the adjoining parish of Ash, so that the parents of two popular female writers must have been intimately acquainted with each other. As my subject carries me back about 100 years, it will afford occasions for observing many changes gradually effected in the manners and habits of society, which I may think it worthwhile to mention. They may be little things, but time gives a certain importance even to trifles, as it imparts a peculiar flavour to wine. The most ordinary articles of domestic life are looked on with some interest if they are brought to light after being long buried, and we feel a natural curiosity to know what was done and said by our forefathers, even though it may be nothing wiser or better than what we are daily doing or saying ourselves. Some of this generation may be little aware how many conveniences, now considered to be necessaries and matters of course, were unknown to their grandfathers and grandmothers. The lane between Deane and Steventon has long been regarded as smooth as the best turnpike road, but when the family removed from the one residence to the other in 1771, it was a mere cart track, so cut up by deep ruts as to be impossible for a light carriage. Mrs. Austen, who was not then in strong health, performed the short journey on a feather bed placed upon some soft articles of furniture in the waggon which held their household goods. In those days, it was not unusual to set men to work with shovel and pickaxe to fill up the ruts and holes in roads seldom used by carriages, on such special occasions as a funeral or a wedding. Ignorance and coarseness of language also were still lingering, even upon higher levels of society, than might have been expected to retain such mists. About this time, a neighbouring squire, a man of many acres, referred the following difficulty to Mr. Austen's decision. You know all about these sort of things. Do tell us, is Paris in France or France in Paris? For my wife has been disputing with me about it. The same gentleman, narrating some conversation which he had heard between the rector and his wife, represented the latter as beginning her reply to her husband with a round oath, and when his daughter called him to task, reminding him that Mrs. Austen never swore, he replied, "Now, Betty, why do you pull me up for nothing? That's neither here nor there. You know very well that's only my way of telling the story." Attention has lately been called by a celebrated writer to the inferiority of the clergy to the laity of England 2 centuries ago. The charge, no doubt, is true. If the rural clergy are to be compared with that higher section of country gentlemen who went into Parliament and mixed in London society and took the lead in their several counties, but it might be found less true if they were to be compared, as in all fairness they ought to be, with that lower section with whom they usually associated. The smaller landed proprietors who seldom went farther from home than their county town, from the squire with his 1,000 acres to the yeoman who cultivated his hereditary property of 100 or 200, then formed a numerous class, each the aristocrat of his own parish. And there was probably a greater difference in manners and refinement between this class and that immediately above them than could now be found between any two persons who rank as gentlemen. For in the progress of civilization, though all orders may make some progress, yet it is almost perceptible in the lower. It is a process of levelling up, the rear rank dressing up, as it were, close to the front rank. When Hamlet mentions as something which he had for 3 years taken note of, that the toe of the peasant comes so near the heel of the courtier, it was probably intended by Shakespeare as a satire on his own times, but it expressed a principle which is working at all times in which society makes any progress. I believe that a century ago the improvement in most country parishes began with the clergy, and that in those days a rector who chanced to be a gentleman and a scholar found himself superior to his chief parishioners in information and manners, and became a sort of centre of refinement and politeness.